So we're almost at the end of this incredible vision, beginning to head towards the final climax. And you'll remember possibly that last time we reached what seemed to be the culmination of the visions. Onto the stage strode the rider on the white horse, who is called the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And of course, he was none other than Jesus himself. And he came as righteous judge with his retinue of saints, and we witnessed that great supper of God. The beast and the false prophet were captured and hurled into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. And the kings of the earth and their armies were cut to pieces. And the fate of those who opposed God was therefore assured. Jesus will triumph over all his enemies. But behind Babylon the Great, who we saw the downfall of in chapter 18, and behind the beast and behind this false prophet is the dragon, Satan himself. And he has been given, or he has given the beast his power. And the beast and the false prophet are manifestations of the devil's schemes to draw men away from God. So the question remains, what happens to Satan? He's in fact barely mentioned after his introduction in chapter 12, yet we know that he's been the unseen power behind the anti-God rebellion. And at the end of chapter 19, only those he controlled and inspired are dealt with. He himself is apparently still at large. So when we get to chapter 20, we read of his fate. So I'll read the chapter before we consider it, Revelation 20. And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, the ancient snake, who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations any more until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that, he must be set free for a short time. I saw thrones on which were seated those who've been given authority to judge, and I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. And they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number they are like the sand on the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who is seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books are opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Well, however the 1,000 years is interpreted, the main point of this passage is to describe the fate of the devil. His fate, his end, is the same as that of the beast and the false prophet. He is heading for that lake of burning sulfur. But how do we interpret this 1,000-year period, this so-called millennium? As many of you know, there are a number of different views on this passage, and if you are at the service, there's a handout summarizing the options. And amongst evangelicals today, the two most popular views about this millennium are called the amillennialist position, and secondly, the premillenial position. And there are many variants within each of those. But in outline, amillennialism says that basically this passage is another recap, a recapitulation. The number 1,000 is viewed as symbolic, a number just as other numbers are symbolic in this book. And the 1,000 years is symbolic of the church age. In other words, we are currently living in this millennium. It represents a definite period of time determined by God, usually synonymous with the 3.5 years mentioned earlier in the book, which is also identified as the church age. So it's the time between Christ's first coming and his second. And since in the chronology of the book, Christ has been depicted in chapter 19 as returning, this means that chapter 20 must be a recapitulation, just as we considered it to be in chapter 12 and possibly in chapter 15. This view was held by some of the early church fathers, so it has a long pedigree, and it's held by Luther and Calvin, and it's particularly strong, I think, in Reformed churches. What about premillennialism? Well, this view usually sees this 1,000-year period literally, but more importantly, it views the 1,000 years beginning after Christ returns. So this view sees chapter 20 following chronologically in time from chapter 19. And again, it's held by some early church fathers. It has a long pedigree. It's later held by Spurgeon, and many mainline evangelicals hold this view today. Now, just to underline the kind of legitimacy of both of these interpretations amongst evangelicals, then just consider the commentary series that many find helpful, the Tyndale New Testament commentaries published by IVP. Well, volume 20, which some of you might have on your bookshelves, was written by Leon Morris, and he takes an amillennial view. However, the newest edition, written by Ian Paul, takes a premillennial stance. And the point is that mainline evangelical commentaries from exactly the same stable can take quite different views when it comes to this chapter. So what I'm going to do is look at the passage and explain how these two views interpret the verses. And my aim is to give both views a reasonably good hearing in the short time that we've got available. And maybe frustratingly for some, I'm not necessarily going to come down on one side or the other. So let's start with verses 1 to 3. Satan is bound for this 1,000 years. An angel descends from heaven with the key to the abyss. The angel seizes the dragon, who, as in chapter 12, is identified very clearly for us. He's bound for 1,000 years and thrown into the abyss, which is locked and sealed. And this is referred to as a prison in verse 7. He's kept bound and locked up to prevent him, we're told, from deceiving the nations. Then at the end of the 1,000 years, he's to be released for a short time to deceive the nations again. So what do the amillennialists say? Well, in this view, remember the 1,000 years is symbolic of the church age. So how do they interpret this binding of Satan? Well, for the amillennialists, it signifies restriction of Satan's power during the church age. When Christ came first, at his first coming, he demonstrated his superiority and power over Satan by casting out demons. In Matthew 12, verses 25 to 29, Jesus tells a parable in which he explains that he has overpowered and bound Satan in order to plunder his house. And that word bound is the same Greek word that we find in this passage in Revelation 20. And a number of other verses in the New Testament make it clear that Satan was defeated at the cross, a theme that we've considered a number of times in Revelation. But in what way is Satan then prevented from deceiving the nations? Well, John 12:31 is another verse which speaks of Satan's downfall, and it also throws light on this. Jesus says, "Now the prince of this world will be thrown out." And he's referring to his triumph over Satan through his death and resurrection. And he goes on to say in that passage, "But when I am lifted up, I will draw all men to myself." So this is in a passage, when you look back at John chapter 12, which is about Greeks, Gentiles, coming to Jesus. And Jesus is basically saying that when he dies, Satan will be thrown out and all the nations will be drawn to himself. The good news, the blessings, will be for all nations, not just the Jews. No longer will Satan be able to keep the nations, the Gentiles, in his custody. He has been bound, and the gospel is now freely available to all. As Jesus said at the end of Matthew's gospel, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples of all nations." So how then is his release interpreted? At the end of the age, Satan is released for a short time. And this might be a reference to 2 Thessalonians 2:7, which talks of the man of lawlessness who is at present held back, but will one day be revealed. It says this: "The secret power of lawlessness is already at work, but the one who holds it back will continue to do so till he's taken out of the way. Then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow by the splendor of his coming." Satan is present, but he is restrained. And at the end of the age, he will be released, only to be overthrown by the splendor of Christ's coming. In other words, the gospel age, Satan's power is restricted, and the gospel is available to all nations. So what the amillennialist is trying to do here is to use the truths that are clearly taught in Scripture to interpret what is believed to be a difficult, largely symbolic passage. And of course, it may be wrong, but the truths that I've just outlined are still valid. What about the premillenial interpretation? Well, the premillennialists see a lot of problems with amillennialism. The binding and imprisonment of Satan described here seems far more restrictive than we see today. Yes, Satan is a defeated foe, but not to the degree implied by Revelation 20. After all, Peter describes Satan as a prowling lion, looking for someone to devour. And not only that, Satan seems all too powerful in Revelation 12 and 13, as he gives the beasts their power over all the nations. Read again chapter 13, and sets about his murderous activity through their agency. As to Satan being prevented from deceiving the nations, well, what about Paul's statement that the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers? Surely the nations are still deceived in the church age, or they'd all be converted. So in this view, the 1,000 years is a literal period which follows the coming of Christ to defeat his enemies in chapter 19. And Satan is bound and left to be dealt with later. Unbelievers are also left to be dealt with at the end of the 1,000-year period. And there still appear to be nations, although one difficulty here is that all the nations rebelled in chapter 19 and were then defeated. It's not clear whether this 1,000-year period has both believers and unbelievers on the earth. The fact that Satan has been restrained might imply that they're all converted. And this then raises other questions. Is there still sin on the earth? Are conditions the same on the earth as they are now? Do people die? Is there pain and suffering? We're not told. And some think conditions are different from now, and others think that they are similar. For instance, some believe that what is described at the beginning of chapter 21, the new heaven and the new earth, actually occurs at the beginning of the millennium, not at the end. Then when Satan is released, some rebel. Are these believers who turn away, or were there always unbelievers on the earth during this 1,000-year period? And if Satan's imprisonment is much more restrictive than the curtailment he suffers in the current age, all would be converted. If so, how is he then able to inspire rebellion at the end? So getting to grips with what it will be like in that 1,000-year period is very difficult. Details are very sketchy in this passage, which is perhaps one of the weaknesses of this view. So the next section gives us some clues about that 1,000-year period, what it's like. It's very circumspect and many would argue highly confusing. So verses 4 to 6, John sees the thrones on which are seated those who've been given authority to judge. Are these thrones in heaven or on earth? Many put them on earth, but we're not told who's seated on them. Well, John sees the souls of those who have been beheaded, of those who've not worshipped the beast. And some see these martyrs as only the group who sit on the thrones, who had not worshipped the beast, and who come to life and reign with Christ for this 1,000-year period. But others argue, and this is in fact both amillennial and premillennials, that all God's people who did not worship the beast are included, not just the martyrs. And the alternative translation, which is in a footnote of the NIV, suggests this. I also saw those. So it's not just those who were beheaded, but also another group. And verse 6 says that they are priests of God and of Christ and reign with him for this 1,000 years. And this is a description, of course, that fits all believers. Anyway, this group comes to life. The rest of the dead do not rise, and this is called the first resurrection. What is this first resurrection, this coming to life? Well, one thing is clear. Those who come to life will escape the second death, which is described at the end of the chapter. They'll not be thrown into the lake of fire, the second death. Well, how do the amillennials interpret this? If the 1,000 years is the church age, then there are two possibilities. First, the resurrection might be a reference to what happens to Christians, or possibly just the martyrs when they die. They go to be with Christ and reign with him in glory. And thus the first resurrection is translational. And the second resurrection at the end of the age is bodily. Or there's another possibility. The second possibility is that the first resurrection is primarily a reference to new birth, to new life. When we become Christians, we're made alive, having been dead, and we're seated with Christ in the heavenly realms. Remember how Paul puts it in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 5. God made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgression. And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus. Does that match what's being described here in these verses? Death to life, being seated with Christ. And the reference to the resurrected being priests and reigning with Christ simply describes Christians now, at present. Peter in his epistle calls us a holy priesthood, a royal nation. It doesn't have to refer to a future period. So again, the amillennials are trying to fit the New Testament truths into what they see as a largely symbolic passage. What about premillennials? Well, basically, they say that this coming to life, this resurrection, has to be a bodily resurrection. First, the word resurrection in the New Testament, everywhere else, refers to bodily resurrection. It seems to be the most natural interpretation of that phrase, first resurrection, in verse 5. And secondly, that phrase coming to life in verse 4 is not likely to be rebirth or temporary state after death, because that phrase is mentioned a second time in verse 5. It says this: the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. And that second mention clearly is about bodily resurrection. So if that phrase came to life is about bodily resurrection in verse 5, then it almost certainly is in verse 4. So if this is all about bodily resurrection, it can only be after Christ returns. It's dispute about whether this is bodily resurrection of just the martyred, or whether it's all believers. If it's just the martyred, then the rest of believers are resurrected at the end of the 1,000 years. If it's all believers, then the rest of the dead are unbelievers who are judged at the end of the 1,000-year period. And Christ reigns, whether on earth or in heaven is perhaps not clear, but he reigns with the saints. There's open speculation about what happens during this 1,000-year reign, but it's largely viewed as a utopian time that seems to just fall short of the new heaven and the new earth of chapter 21. And the extent to which sin has been eradicated is again open to question. Satan, after all, has still to be dealt with. And we move on to verses 7 to 10. Following that circumspect description of the 1,000 years, the end is sketched for us. Satan has been bound and imprisoned for these 1,000 years. He's released. He's now able to lead the nations astray. The nations are referred to as Gog and Magog, so many that no one can number them, and they are gathered for battle. Well, what are Gog and Magog? Well, this is a reference almost certainly to Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, which is the only other place where Gog and Magog are mentioned. They are nations which come from the north to attack Israel, but they are destroyed in that passage. And some see that passage in Ezekiel as a general background. Gog and Magog simply symbolize the nations on the earth which are defeated in Ezekiel, and just as surely are defeated here. Others see that passage in Ezekiel being fulfilled here in perhaps a more literal way. Either Israel represents the church, or it is in fact the Jews who are primarily under attack in this passage. And this great army marches across the breadth of the earth, surrounds the camp of God's people, the city he loves. And is this symbolic of the church, a reference to the church, exiles and strangers in the world? Or does this reference be of a more literal Jerusalem, the city he loves? Either way, fire comes down from heaven, the armies are destroyed, and the devil is thrown into the lake of burning sulfur with the beast and the false prophet. And Satan's plans and influences come to nothing. He's assigned to eternal punishment. His end is assured. Well, Amillennialists interpret this 1,000-year period as representing the church age. So therefore, this battle scene is a recapitulation of chapter 19. It's the Battle of Armageddon. For the amillennialists, there is only one final battle involving all the nations, which repeatedly is mentioned through the book. And that battle is at the close of the age. Satan's release represents a final upsurge in evil, which until this point has been held back. And the camp of God's people, the city he loves, is the church on earth. The fire devours is the Lord returning in flaming fire. Premillennialists, for them, the battle describes what follows the literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. And during that 1,000-year, rebellion has perhaps grown. Sin is still in people's hearts. Satan simply brings it to a focus. He deceives the nations into gathering against God's people. There's a second great battle, which is different from that in chapter 19. But like that battle, it's over before it's begun. Satan is defeated and joins the beast and the false prophet. So, who is right after all of that? Now, if you come at this with an open mind, I think it is difficult to decide between the two views. Amillennialism has its advantages. It's consistent with the message of the New Testament as a whole, where there is no other mention of a 1,000-year reign. And it treats the passage largely symbolically, which is in line with the nature of the whole book. But it has the problem of being perhaps a less straightforward reading of the text. Premillennialism has the advantage that it interprets these chapters sequentially in what therefore seems a more straightforward way. And it seems to interpret that phrase coming to life as bodily resurrection more consistently. But it also has problems, particularly, I think, in envisaging an interim period that falls short of the final perfection. For some, at least, it's difficult to envisage a world where Christ has returned in glory, where the resurrection has occurred, at least in some way, and yet there still seems to be sin present. There's no doubt that Christ will return. And when he does, we'll certainly find out who is right. Either we'll find out that the millennium is about to begin, or we'll find out that it's just ended. But we haven't finished this chapter yet. Verses 11 to 15, we have another vision where the dead are judged. And what is depicted here occurs at the end of this 1,000 years after Christ returns, or it happens at the end of that 1,000 years after Christ has reigned. And in many ways, we're on much surer ground with this passage. So let's deal with it perhaps a little bit more quickly because it is more familiar. What happens is this: the dead are raised and judged, both great and small. There's no distinction. Books are opened, and these books contain what appears to be the record of men's lives. But another book is also opened, the book of life. And we've already been introduced to that book earlier in Revelation in chapter 3, verse 5 and 13, verse 8. That book of life belongs to the Lamb. Those who've been purchased by him and who've overcome have their names written in it. What counts is not the record of what we have done, but whether our name is in the book of life. The record of what we have done will largely condemn us. But if our name is written in the Lamb's book of life, we escape the second death, the lake of fire. And the message of this passage, these verses, is clear. After death comes judgment. Jesus said, "Don't fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Don't fear the first death, but fear the second death. Make sure your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And the climax of it all is that death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. This is the final triumph. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:26, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And now we're ready for the new age where there will be no more death. Death has finally been defeated. So let me sum up after a really pretty long talk. The Revelation is a difficult book, not least because committed evangelical Christians hold different views on its detailed interpretation, and not least on this chapter. But in the confusion this can generate, we mustn't lose sight of the big picture. From this passage, we can be encouraged because God is in control. God will have the final victory. Satan, the arch enemy, will be finally dealt with. And we can be confident that God will triumph. And we can be assured because although God's judgment is certain and cannot be avoided, and for those who have not followed the Lamb, the punishment is severe. For those who have followed the Lamb, our future with God is assured. Our names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And of these things, we can be certain.